Today may be the best day that Ukraine has had this year. Yes, even better than June 1st, the date of Operation Spiderweb. That is because US President Donald Trump and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte announced a major new arms deal that has the potential to give Ukraine what it needs to get back into the war. So, on tap for today, we have 7 things to discuss. First, we will tackle what exactly appears to be happening, which consists of 2 parts: military transfers and secondary sanctions. And man, the number of wrong things that I have heard about the latter in the last 2 hours is way too many. Then we will discuss why it is happening now, which itself has 3 subpoints. It is not that Trump has finally learned that Putin was stringing him along, contrary to much of what you will be hearing. Rather, there has been an important shift in the internal dynamics of the Republican Party. Plus, there is the external shift in NATO spending priorities. I will then look at 2 lingering questions. First, how the new announcement does not solve the underlying problem with US defense priorities. And second, whether this will make any progress toward an end to the war. But we begin with what is actually happening, starting with the military part. The 5-second version of the announcement is that the United States is reopening its warehouses to Europe to supply Ukraine for the war effort. The more precise version is that there is a more complicated forwarding and backfilling program that is about to be implemented. The United States has implicitly approved European partners to forward their US-made weapons to Ukraine, never mind anything manufactured by Europe directly that Europe can therefore directly choose what to do with. Meanwhile, the Trump administration will offer to sell European countries whatever they donated to Ukraine, essentially to backfill what is necessary for Europe's own defense. Trump and Rutte did not place any limits on the type of materiel covered. In practice, there are physical limitations to the US supply chains and political considerations as well, so it will not be unlimited in practice, but it sure does seem like the scope is quite large. One thing that we know is covered is the US Patriot system, which has become increasingly necessary as Russia ramps up its drone campaign against Ukrainian cities. Germany has already announced that it will send over 2. Norway is chipping in another, and there is discussion of 17 overall. What is interesting about the structure of the agreement is that it will have immediate effect. Germany is not going to wait around on the United States to send over the Patriots it already owns. Rather, Germany will just do it, and then wait for the United States to backfill its supplies later. This is what NATO excels at. Indeed, it was one of the consequences of NATO invoking Article 5 way back in 2001, with the roles reversed and Europe backfilling American materiel to support the war effort in Afghanistan. For now, it is hard to describe exactly how this will change the battlefield in Ukraine. An answer there would depend on a clearer picture of what Europe plans to procure from the United States. But clearly it does change the expected outcome of the war in Ukraine's favor. And it is not just the weapons themselves that are influencing that expectation. It is also how the Trump administration is showing that it is actually willing to help the war effort in Ukraine, something that looked quite questionable approximately 4.5 months ago, and also something that has dominated the online discourse in the time since. The Trump administration may not be so committed that it will approve more money spent by the United States directly on Ukraine, but the United States can supply more and better materiel than Europe can on many fronts, and as long as Europe is willing to pay for it, something that has become increasingly clear over the last month, then the United States will be happy to act as a main supplier. But that was not the only announcement today. There was also an important bit about secondary sanctions. Specifically, Trump announced a new sanctions package to be implemented in 50 days against all countries doing business with Russia. This is kind of confusing, and I did get some perverse enjoyment out of watching newscasters try, and fail to explain what exactly a secondary sanction is. To be clear, this is not a sanction levied against Russia. Indeed, at this point, sanctions against Russia are effectively meaningless because there is basically no meaningful trade conducted between the United States and Russia, and that has been true for a very long time. Indeed, Russia was not even included in the Liberation Day tariffs package because, again, there is not a meaningful tariff to levy. Iran was also not on that list for the same reason. Rather, a secondary sanction is implemented on countries taking advantage of the existing sanctions regime. So, real talk, when you see someone say otherwise either online or in real life in the next couple of days, spend a minute correcting them, because it is really bad and shows a lack of knowledge of what is going on in the news. You see, when you close your markets to Russian exports, the price of Russian exports goes down on international markets. Simple supply and demand. That makes the goods more attractive to other countries looking for a great deal. And that is how you have countries like China and India making money hand over fist on Russian oil exports, never mind other products. Secondary sanctions attempt to keep the sanctions regime in place by punishing those importers of last resort. Specifically, Trump announced that, in 50 days, the United States will levy a 100% tariff on such countries supporting Russia's war effort implicitly. Again, this is mostly applying to China and India, but it might also extend to countries like South Africa and Brazil. Now, unlike the last one, I would exercise a little bit of caution here. The arms shipments are happening immediately and will be subject to procurement contracts. That means that Ukraine will start seeing weapons potentially this week. And while the United States could conceivably break the backfilling pledge, doing so would get all tied up in contract disputes and court rulings. So it is a mess that the Trump administration would have to be really motivated to want to pursue. In contrast, we have seen the Trump administration grant all sorts of extensions to Russia to allow a diplomatic process to take place. Hence the caution here about whether 50 days really means 50 days. Then again, a main target here would be China. Trump loves tariffs and hates China, so this is a match made in heaven for him. And to be fair, some type of delay here is reasonable. Now that this is the official policy of the US government, it gives time to China and India to apply domestic pressure to Russia without burning bridges. It will also give US businesses some time to reconsider their own import strategies, knowing that a massive sanction might soon apply to Chinese and Indian goods. But it remains something to watch as we reach the end of August. Okay, but why is this happening now? One bad explanation for this is that Trump has concluded that Putin was stringing him along. Well, Trump has concluded that. The key point is that this was a conclusion that the Trump administration drew months ago, so it is not explaining the July timing of the announcement. Let's rewind. It was plausible to think that Trump believed that the Biden administration had so badly bungled the handling of the war that Trump sincerely believed that he could convince Russia to agree to a ceasefire, even if his 24-hour promise was hyperbole. But within a couple of months, it had become clear to everyone in the administration that there would be no simple solution. Even Trump's rhetoric on this changed, with him openly musing that Putin was just tapping him along. Yet Trump kept pushing deadlines for the Kremlin further and further back. Why? Well, I did a deep dive on this over on Lines on Maps Extra, but the basic point is that he was actually stringing all of us along all along. To do something about the war, Trump would have to exert real effort and pay real costs. As we will get to in a moment, he did not want to. Thus, it was more politically convenient to portray Putin as injecting uncertainty into the situation, rather than advertising the United States' own weakness. Simultaneously, the Trump administration knew that arming Ukraine, conditional on Russia not agreeing to a ceasefire, would be necessary to induce the Kremlin to come to the bargaining table in the first place, It was the linchpin of Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg's peace plan all along. But the real problem was China. And that takes us to a recent evolution in the internal dynamics of the Republican Party. To make things more complicated, this is a sub-story about the America First coalition that won Trump his second term. There are two very different camps that use the America First moniker. One group that believes in complete U.S. isolation, and a second group that might be better branded as unapologetically America. The United States is the strongest country in the world, and it should do whatever it wants to do, and not feel bad about it. Well, the last 6 months have shown that this latter group is the one that controls U.S. foreign policy. An isolationist America would look at the Red Sea and declare it to be not my job, and move on with its life. Instead, we saw Operation Prosperity Guardian. An isolationist America would look at Israel's air war against Iran, point at how far away it is on a map from the United States, and again move on with its life. Instead, we saw B-2 bombers play mop-up duty and destroy key Iranian nuclear installations that Israel did not have the capacity to hit. The problem is that, within the unapologetically America camp, there is debate on which areas of operation deserve the greatest focus. Within the Pentagon, China is the emphasis, best exemplified by Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby's active reorientation. Indeed, it appears that the Pentagon had unilaterally halted delivery of weapons to Ukraine that were sitting in Poland, just waiting to complete the final leg of their journey. This was the fallout from the 12-day war. The United States had depleted too much of its materiel via weapons shipments to Israel, and the Pentagon feared that it was becoming woefully unprepared for a battle against China. But the Pentagon's view differed from many Republicans. Senator Tom Cotton, for example, held up Colby's confirmation, precisely because of the would-be undersecretary's singular focus on Indo-Pacific relations. Cotton thought that other places, like Iran, also needed some attention. Meanwhile, you have another group of Republicans who want to see serious action taken on Ukraine. Senator Lindsey Graham is the most prominent of these. And actually, do you remember that secondary sanctions thing? That is an initiative from the U.S. Senate, where there are 85 senators co-sponsoring a bill to give the president that power. It seems that the Pentagon's sudden aid cut catalyzed support for the pro-Ukraine group, and that has pushed Trump into rethinking whether all of his eggs should be in the China basket. But that was happening concurrently with a second major policy change: NATO spending. You will recall how at the Hague NATO summit last month, the Allies agreed to spend 5% of GDP on defense. 3.5% goes to core defense, the traditional men and materiel you think of when it comes to war. You may also recall a key thing that I learned from an Assistant Secretary General while at the summit. The 3.5% number came from calculating what would be necessary to implement a NATO defense plan, originally created in 2019, and then updated for current events in Ukraine. I mention that because NATO officially includes assistance to Ukraine as a part of the 3.5% spending. That makes sense. If 3.5% is what is necessary to stop Russia, you could leave it in reserve in Europe. Or you could forward it to Ukraine, attrit Russian forces there, and then not need as much left over to protect yourself now that Russia is a weaker foe. Well, the Allies all agreed to this, notwithstanding Spain's belief that it can build everything it is supposed to for substantially less money. Regardless, that means a gigantic pot of cash just opened up, and it is the type of thing that U.S. defense contractors would salivate at. You know, the companies that create the same kind of jobs that the Trump administration desperately wants to bring back onshore. Now, the United States understands that not all of the money will make its way across the Atlantic. In fact, the Pentagon openly welcomes development in Europe's military-industrial base because the United States cannot handle everything on its own. However, simultaneously, there are three things to consider. One is that it will take years for Europe to build that military-industrial base. That is not a good solution if you are Ukraine and you need all of that stuff now. 2. NATO is fundamentally built on exploiting strategic complementarities. That ought to continue even after Europe has a revitalized defense industry. And that means continued European procurement from the United States to purchase things that the United States is just better at making. 3rd, if the United States wants access to that huge pot of money, it needs to be more cooperative with Europe. And so now we are seeing the United States be more cooperative with Europe. All that said, there are 2 trouble points worth covering here. First is an unsolved problem that the United States has with the program. Look, Trump likes money, and he likes US manufacturing jobs. The agreement will provide one and create the other. But the Colby group of China-focused policymakers are not completely wrong. The United States is the member of the Western coalition that can make a serious contribution to Indo-Pacific security, with its unparalleled ability to project power. Europe cannot. And yes, a war between Ukraine and Russia is ongoing. However, simultaneously, Beijing has been engaged in an increasingly bold campaign of airspace and sea lane games of chicken vis-a-vis Taiwan. The threat is fresh on the minds of individuals inside of the Pentagon, even if that news does not make major headlines. Moreover, it is inescapably true that the United States does not have sufficient materiel to handle both crises at the same time. But it is a political question of how to split the priority, and the White House has decided that 100 for Taiwan and 0 for Ukraine is not the right answer. The solution, of course, is to increase U.S. defense spending. Well, if there is an injection into U.S. defense contractors from Europeans making backfill orders, then perhaps it is time to use that influx of cash to reinvest in the defense industrial base of the United States. 5 or 10 years later, suddenly the United States has the military-industrial capacity to handle both. For the final thought, we should ask the biggest question of all: will this plan actually end the war? And the one part of the answer I can give is no, not immediately. As a more general point, I think it is important to temper expectations here. This agreement may bring Ukraine somewhat back to what the world looked like under the Biden administration, but it is not going to put Ukraine in complete control of the war. Meanwhile, we have discussed way too many times the central bargaining problem between Russia and Ukraine, and it persists today. You need the expected outcome of a war continuously fought in the present to match the expected outcome of a war if restarted following a ceasefire. A gap remains between the two because Ukraine still has not solidified its defensive lines. It needs trenches that can halt Russia's offensive as it is ongoing. Until Ukraine has those, the Kremlin will prefer to continue its campaign precisely to deny Ukraine that opportunity. Broadly speaking, more weapons for Ukraine will help with that. However, Patriots are the weapons that are receiving the most attention right now, yet they will do very little to further that purpose. What Ukraine really needs is more stopping power on the front lines. For example, an endless supply of 155mm artillery shells would prevent Russia from pressuring Ukrainian defensive positions. Then Ukraine can use that time to further fortify the line, so that Russia will be deterred from continuing to assault those positions, even after those artillery shells are no longer constantly raining down. So, again, we need to wait and see what is actually happening with specific weapons orders. Either way, it will take time, because Ukraine will need to dig, and it might not be until the late fall rains and the early winter frost when we might get some convergence in the current and post-ceasefire expectations. Until then, you could check out this deep dive that I made on the secondary sanctions package that is posted to, coincidentally, my secondary channel. Or perhaps I could interest you in a couple of awesome books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.